Hello everyone, my name is Carrie, my pronouns are she, her, and welcome back to another episode of Carrie Plays Kerbal. In the last episode, we sent a manned rover to Minmus, although it didn't work too well. Then we put our first satellite in orbit to scan for Easter eggs. And finally, we sent deep space probes to do flybys of Drace and the entire Joule system, so that we could use their science points to unlock the entire tech tree. Now in this episode, you join me as I'm constructing a brand new lander that I'm going to send to EELOO, the furthest planet from the sun in the game. This will be our first craft that utilizes the nuclear engines, which are very efficient in a vacuum and also only require liquid fuel and no oxidizer. So you can see I've got this top stage just full of a bunch of liquid fuel tanks. For the actual landing module, it's basically the same as the one we've been using, although now I can shed the extra weight of the science experiments since we won't need them anymore. And while I know that part clipping and especially fuel tank clipping is something of a sin in the community, I don't think it's too egregious here. I definitely could have left those Mark II fuel tanks just hanging off the side, but it just looked so ugly. Now we'll just speed through as we get to low curb in orbit, as always. I did have a bit of trouble separating and docking the two craft because I didn't get one of the Kerbals out and put them in the landing module before separating it, but we got there eventually. Something we're doing a bit differently here because of the nuclear engines is we're actually going to separate our trans-EELOO insertion burn into two burns, because as you can see the nuclear engines actually take a very long time to complete any substantial maneuvers. I set up our first burn to get our apoapsis just inside the sphere of influence of Kerbin itself, and it takes a whole 9 real-life minutes. Then, as we come back around and reach periapsis again, I set up our second half of the burn, which takes another 12 minutes. You can't time warp under acceleration in the base game, so I just sat here for all of that actual time while it burned. Luckily, through the magic of video editing, we can do them instantly. Now I'm just setting up a mid-course correction burn to change our plane to be the same as that of EELOO. And here you can see we get a very close periapsis. This is because the closer you are to a body, the more efficient your burns are. This is called the Oberth effect. And although I've never mentioned it by name, we've taken advantage of it many times in the series so far. I perform our EELOO capture burn. And now we get Bill and Bob in the lander. After burning retrograde a bit, they are on a collision course with the planet. Or perhaps dwarf planet. I'm not sure whether or not EELOO is supposed to be based on Pluto, but it's inspired at least in part by it. And now we touch down safely once again. Luckily, these large rocks stop us from sliding all over the place. I decide to have Bill get out this time to be the first Kerbal to step on the surface because he hasn't got to do it yet, and you can tell he definitely didn't get any practice in. And he plants the flag of the Endurance mission. I initially decided to call this the Endurance after the ship that sailed to Antarctica, because EELOO is so far away and so cold. But I later realized that that also happens to be the name of the station from Interstellar, which is somewhat appropriate in hindsight. I find this interesting looking rock formation over here, and I think if I send the Kerbals over towards it I can scan it, but it turns out that's not something you can do with just Kerbals. I believe that you can look into these with the rover scanning arms that we have yet to use. After Bill takes a second to contemplate the many sins he's committed with his own two hands, we decide that it's time to head home. We ended up getting the lander on a pretty close intersection pretty easily, and now we just dock as usual, killing our relative speed and then aiming each craft at its mate until they meet. I start our trans-Kerbin insertion burn by using the last of the lander fuel, and after that runs out I turn back on the nuclear engines and use them for the rest. Initially, our crew seems pretty happy to be heading home, but then re-entry starts. However, as always, we touch down safely. Now, we've done plenty of landers, we know we can do that, but what about sending a space plane to somewhere? So I take another page out of NASA's book and decide to steal this German World War II design. This is the Comet. I didn't even bother to change the name because I felt like Comet with a K was already Kerbal enough. This was the first rocket-powered plane to reach mass production. I'm trying to make an aircraft that we can send to Laythe, the ocean moon of Joule, but it needs to do 3 things. Enter Laythe's atmosphere, splash down safely, and take off again to return the pilot to the orbiter. As you can see, it runs out of fuel extremely quickly, which is actually historically accurate, but unfortunately I can't seem to get it to glide down safely. So Reed just bails out. I think I can get us a bit higher if I decide to just launch vertically, which again is historically accurate, but it doesn't really get us much further. Laythe has a slightly thinner atmosphere and a bit less gravity than Kerbin, so we can do our trials here at home. If it can do all the things we need it to do on Kerbin, it can definitely do them on Laythe, with some additional room for error. After adding a bit more fuel, it does actually get to space, but upon re-entry the Comet really lives up a bit too much to her namesake. Unfortunately for Reed, the atmosphere of Kerbin heard about the origin of this design and took it upon itself to utterly destroy the right wing. So Reed prepares to do what has now become the standard landing procedure for this craft, but not before first doing his best impression of a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. Clearly the Comet is an objective failure at anything useful, but I have just one more question. What if Space Shuttle? So clearly the Comet didn't work too well. What about something inspired by a later, more useful design? Well, let's play a game of Who's That Historical Aircraft? It's the MiG-15. I called mine the Keg instead of the MiG because this thing is built like a barrel. But the MiG-15 was a Soviet-built swept-wing jet that was designed to intercept heavy bombers, although it also did well in a dogfighting role. Despite being introduced in 1949, some of these are still in service as training aircraft in North Korea. Now that we know it's got good bones, I replaced the engine and air intake with some beefier ones. And now Dodo checks the top speed, and we determine that it can reach over 1500 meters per second. But only once. If I settle down a bit and don't get us burned up on the ascent, we can actually get to space in this thing. However, I don't like how squirrely it is on re-entry. As you can see here, Dodo has to continually spin the craft just to try and bleed off speed and heat so it doesn't destroy itself. Although it does still try to divide into its constituent parts. It's also too wide to fit in a reasonably sized fairing, so I won't be using it for our Laythe mission. That leaves just one question. What if Space Shuttle? No, clearly not. So I try one more time. This is our final design that we will send to Laythe. I present to you the Buccaneer. Wait, hold on a second. I present to you the Buccaneer. So, why is it called the Buccaneer, you may ask? That sounds nautical, aquatic even. Yes, dear viewer, you're catching on. Unrelated to the historical aircraft of the same name, I actually called it this just because my football team is the Buccaneers and I think it's a cool name, but also it can do this. Yes, the Buccaneer can not only plane, but it can also boat and even submarine. And after being boat and submarine, it can quite easily be plane again. Pretty neat. I tried a couple modifications to get it to take off more smoothly, but this thing on the runway is about as stable as my mental health. I run our tests and determine that it can easily enter an atmosphere, splash down safely, and reach space again. So now we're ready for the final mission. I attach it to the top of this rocket, which has a nuclear-powered final stage that we'll use as an orbiter, much the same as our EELOO mission. The only real difference being I decided to use one of these Soviet-style command pods just to mix things up a bit. The first time I tried to launch this rocket, I forgot to use struts, and this happened. And now we're ready to send Reed and Dodo off into the cosmos. So Reed gets out and into the Buccaneer itself to attempt the most important part of this mission. After blazing through the sky like a Baker Mayfield touchdown pass, we have to see if this thing can actually indeed touch down. This ended up being the most difficult part of the mission, although I, of course being the master at this game that I am, did it flawlessly on the first try. Observe. As I said, first try. Now Reed gets out for the photo op and demonstrates that Laythe actually has a breathable atmosphere. After doing a couple dolphin dives to gain speed, we end up taking off. But unfortunately, we run out of fuel just before we can actually achieve orbit. So Reed thinks on his feet. What we're going to do here is we're going to have him get out, and he's going to use his RCS thruster pack to actually achieve the rest of the delta V needed for a stable orbit. The plane itself will fall harmlessly back and burn up in the moon's atmosphere, but Reed will be saved by his jetpack. All according to plan, and now Dodo in the orbiting craft performs a successful rendezvous with him. So Reed gets back in and we're ready to go home. I use a couple gravity assists to fling ourselves out of Joule's sphere of influence to save a bit of fuel, so we actually get a bonus flyby of Val. And finally, after over 6 long Kerbal years, they've made it home once again. So that was all for today's episode. Please don't forget to click the like button if you liked the video, hit subscribe if you want to see more, or I will put you on our next prototype space shuttle. Your choice.